different from most other people's. For one thing, I was usually the only Unitarian in my class at school. To be honest, I didn't appreciate the distinction. I already had an odd Welsh name that no one had ever heard of or seemed able to pronounce. Plus, I was painfully shy. So shy, in fact, that I had spent most of kindergarten hiding under the grand piano. In my world, to stand out was to invite ridicule. There was Sunday, of course, the one day out of the week where I might mingle inconspicuously among my own kind. Well, you'd think so anyway. But as it turns out, I was an oddball at church, too. This was because my father was the minister. Not just the minister, either, but the celebrated A. Powell Davies, who spoke out eloquently against Joseph McCarthy and his red baiting, and against racial segregation, who was invited to be on shows like Face the Nation, and was quoted on a regular basis in the Washington Post. Because of my father's celebrity, I was frequently waylaid in the halls of All Souls Church by various ladies who crushed me to their ample bosoms and told me how lucky I was to have a father like that. Male churchgoers looked me straight in the eye and dared me to live up to the high standards of my father's courage and eloquence. I did not want to live up to anything. I just wanted to be normal. At All Souls Church, situated in downtown Washington, D.C., it was modeled after London's St. Martin's in the Fields, replete with a classical-style pediment, supported by Corinthian columns, and endowed with an impressive bell tower that we Sunday school children were invited to explore once a year. The church had a big auditorium plus a balcony, and it was always filled to capacity. There was a professional organist as well as a professional singing quartet. My father ascended and descended the raised pulpit with regal solemnity. At All Souls, services were formal and dignified. Ladies wore hats with veils and men wore suits. I was obliged to wear frilly, elaborately smocked dresses and patent leather shoes that drove me nuts all morning by trying to eat my socks. At the end of the service, everyone recited the Lord's Prayer, even those who didn't believe a word of it. This was, as I recall, a concession to certain elderly long-term parishioners. I'm certain my father didn't approve of sentiments such as, "Lead us not into temptation," but he chose his battles wisely. Various political big shots attended church services from time to time. Included among these were Senator Paul Douglas, Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas, and two-time presidential candidate Adlai E. Stevenson. In Sunday school, we read about two kids named Martin and Judy and pondered the moral conflicts plaguing preschoolers and kindergartners. Later, we read Jesus the Carpenter's Son, and I concluded that overall, the protagonist was a pretty stand-up guy. I also learned that Christians were self-deluded people who believed that Jesus lived with God up in the sky. As for God himself, it turned out that he probably didn't even exist, at least in the sense of the grandfatherly persona most of my classmates prayed to. Apparently, if I wanted to get my wishes granted, I needed to acquire a fairy godmother or discover a magic lamp. Due to, in part, to outspoken contempt on the part of some of my Sunday school teachers, I was sometimes inspired to insult my God-fearing friends and classmates. Predictably, they in turn informed me that I was destined to burn in hell. I did not believe them, but I did, on reflection, regret having hurt their feelings. All that said, I did grasp something positive in the nature of Unitarianism. For instance, I understood that Unitarians stood for justice for all people, and not just for rich white people. In this context, let me explain that All Souls was and is an inner-city church, and that the presence of African Americans among the members of its large congregation was unremarkable. In my teens, I belonged to a drama club formed by some of the kids in my Sunday school, and we regularly performed plays with colorblind casts. I was aware also that when my father was called to the pulpit of All Souls Church, he stopped the church from renting space to the segregated police boys club and invited the integrated Columbia Heights Boys Club to take its place. When Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, reversed the Supreme Court ruling of Plessy versus Ferguson, my father celebrated this triumph from the pulpit. After that, we began to receive threatening phone calls, and I remember I was not allowed for a while to answer the phone. I understood that taking a stand, even in the face of murderous opposition, was something Unitarians valued. Later, while serving as assistant minister at All Souls, the Reverend James Reeb risked his life in the cause of civil rights and was murdered in Selma, Alabama in 1965. I was 13 years old when my father died. For a while, I continued to attend All Souls Church, especially the drama club. At some point, I became aware that new churches were being founded, most, if not all, in the upper middle class Maryland suburbs. In these churches, one of which was founded by my mother, Muriel Davies, there were hardly any dark faces. There was also less talk about social justice and more discussion about breaking the yoke of Christian dogma. When the 60s hit, many Unitarian parents underwent a sort of test of hypocrisy. As their sons quit college and decided to take up organic farming, and their daughters went around braless and marched in peace rallies, mothers and fathers protested that this is not what they had meant when they had celebrated nonconformity. To sympathize with farmers was one thing. To actually be one, quite another. This conflict inspired my mother to preach a sermon entitled, "Did We Really Mean It?", in which she challenged the congregation of River Road Unitarian Church to respect their children's right to choose. Like my father in this regard, my mother fully demonstrated the courage of her convictions. She stood up for what she believed, even in the face of overwhelming opposition. Throughout her long life, she was as faithful to her values as it is possible for a human being to be. As a young adult, I was more interested in Hinduism, Zen Buddhism, and Native American spirituality than I was in Unitarianism. I moved a long way away from my childhood home, married, and gave birth to a daughter. When my daughter was 5 or 6, I returned briefly to the fold. The church I attended on the West Coast was radically different from the one I'd grown up in. For one thing, it wasn't even a church. It was a fellowship and determined to remain one. The congregation was small and consisted largely of senior citizens. The Sunday school was even smaller, and attendance there was erratic. This church, or rather fellowship, went through ministers the way a teacher goes through chalk. Some of the ministers were into improv, so you never knew what might take place during the service. One of them was inspired to perform the dance of Shiva and cavorted around the auditorium wearing what looked like loose-fitting cotton pajamas. Another minister spent 20 minutes tossing a football to various randomly selected congregants. Really, the only thing these Unitarians had in common with my childhood version of Unitarianism was a sense that many of them had of having suffered some sort of trauma due to their Christian upbringing. Since I was not brought up Christian, I have no understanding of this experience. In other words, I was more or less deprived of God, not bludgeoned with him. Was it Emerson or some other self-appointed critic who said that Unitarianism was a feather bed for fallen Christians? I began to wonder if this, more than moral courage and a dedication to social justice, formed the common UU ground. When this congregation voted overwhelmingly to sponsor illegal aliens fleeing from the repressive regime in El Salvador, I was relieved and proud. Flaky though they were, they did in fact have the capacity to take a stand against injustice. Soon after this action, a conflict occurred between the minister and the religious education director. The congregation took sides while reason and compassion were overwhelmed by righteous indignation. Eventually, part of the congregation split off and established a new fellowship. I attended the new fellowship briefly, then quit altogether. I became absorbed by my work in special education, which profoundly influenced my spirituality in ways I can't begin to describe. One of the teachers I worked with was a Mormon who, without piosity or pretense, devoted herself to living what she called a Christian life. Ironically, I learned more from her about respecting each individual's worth and dignity than I did anywhere or from anyone else. I am not suggesting that my particular experience in the UU denomination has much, if any, correspondence with, for want of a better phrase, the truth about Unitarianism. This is partly because I wasn't just another Unitarian. The pedestal of fame on which my father stood increasingly began to feel for him more like a tightrope. His fear of falling, i.e. failing to live up to the adulation surrounding him, resulted in his making some unfortunate choices that had negative consequences for him and for his family. Thus, my sister and I, rather than becoming replicas of our father, ended up dedicating our energies simply to trying to survive. I succeeded in surviving, that is, but my sister did not. Her children, my niece and 2 nephews, though they attended Unitarian Sunday school, have no interest whatsoever in Unitarianism. My oldest nephew regards Unitarians as cocktail party liberals, and my other nephew regarded my mother's idealism as naive and cute. While I don't agree with them, I do understand why they feel as they do. My daughter's perspective on Unitarianism is, however, quite different. Inspired by a Sunday school curriculum that focused on freedom fighters, taught by a dynamic teacher, she walked one day into the local Peace Center and offered her services at the ripe old age of 8. She and her husband continued to explore the issues of spirituality and social justice within the context of Unitarian Universalism. My grandsons also have a strong UU identity. As for myself, though I don't define myself as a Unitarian, I still have the utmost respect for my parents and what they stood for. Their vision of Unitarianism was that it be a powerful force for justice, compassion, and peace in a troubled world. They did not place much value in semantics, nor did they bewail their conventional Christian upbringing. They believed that each individual, however flawed his personal life might be, was capable of placing the common good ahead of his own self-interest. That, I think, is the part of their legacy that is worth living up to, not just for their descendants, but for all of us. I'd like to end by reading a couple of quotes from my father's sermons. True religion says that there is nothing to be feared from anything, whatever, that comes from anywhere at all into an honest mind. The one thing to fear is the mind's dishonesty. The world is now too dangerous for anything but the truth, too small for anything but brotherhood. True religion, like our founding principles, requires that the rights of the disbeliever be equally acknowledged with those of the believer. Thank you.